Good afternoon, folks, and a huge thank you to all of you for coming, and especially to Katrina and the Galway International Arts Festival for enabling this forum. We've talked about it as colleagues here in the university for a number of years. Public intellectualism is probably more important now than ever, and NUIG is committed to public scholarship in really important ways. And I think the reason why is to insist upon critical knowledge, is to insist upon human geographies and humanity that matters, that actually is so often out of view. And I think that critique is more relevant today than ever. And it's also about showcasing relevancy to academic enterprise in and with publics, and ultimately envisioning a better world. And to that end, I can't think of many individuals that I've met in my life as brave and as kind as Sean. For lots of reasons, I think his story is a vignette into our contemporary world, and as a representation of the challenges that we all face in ultimately how we see and frame that world. And he is very sadly suffering the consequences to the ways in which we frame one particularly important concept, which is security. And the question that we're going to be addressing as we have our conversation ultimately is security for whom, from what, and in whose interests. And I suppose I'd like to begin, Sean, by I suppose prompting you to think about and share with us what were the reasons, I suppose, for you being affected so much by what was happening in the Mediterranean to prompt you to volunteer as part of Emergency Response Centre International back in 2018. If you could bring us back to that prompt, was it part of the Alan Kurdi story? Was it part of the ways in which you were drawn into why it is that we need to be affected increasingly by the world?
Yeah, I think people often ask, was it the Alan Kurdi picture? And many of you will remember the picture of Alan Kurdi who washed up in the North Aegean, the young boy. But that wasn't the key moment for me. And when people ask this question, I always try to make sure that it doesn't become a reason why I do things in the future, because those are such rare moments when pictures like that are taken, the opportune moment to take such a devastating picture in such a political context that rallies us to do something. Far more likely than not, I wouldn't have done anything in any case. What it was for me, I think, is a combination of my own upbringing. Having grown up as a blow-in the sticks of Kerry makes me a little bit aware of what it's like to be an outsider, I suppose. And also that I just happened to start studying. I went off to do a master's degree in European defence and security policy. And it so happens that the way that the European Union responds to one of the most severe humanitarian crises to befall the continent, the so-called migrant crisis, is by securing our border against those people who are at risk of drowning, rather than providing help. And it has made the North Aegean, the Mediterranean, one of the deadliest seas in the world, with upwards of 20,000 people who have drowned, needlessly drowned. And I think having had this policy context, understanding that this is happening to some extent in my name, right? Mm-hmm. I think people often also ask, why did you do it and why did you go to Greece? And I think there's a hint of, why did you feel you were able to go to Greece? Volunteerism is something that's, I think, often very validly discussed, and we should be critical of this idea that I can go off and build a school somewhere when I'm not a construction worker or have the skills to do so, or that I'm not involved in certain contexts. But for what happens in Greece, it's happening because I let it happen, because the European Union's border policies are happening to some extent in my name, in our collective name. And it's an outrage because I don't agree with it. I think we shouldn't have our border policies controlled by securitization and by fear of other, but rather by our human rights obligations, our legal obligations to people who are in distress. And so I had this policy understanding, and I happened, growing up in the sticks of Kerry, spent a lot of time in the water. I had a rescue diving certificate. I spent a lot of time scuba diving and rescue swimming and sailing and surfing. And so I felt I also have some practical skills. Why don't I go and combine those two things? Naively, I thought I could help. And so I spent about 3 months on the island of Lesbos, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. It's one of the primary entry points for asylum seekers. If there's been about 2 million people who've come to seek asylum in Europe, half of those have come through Greece, and half of them have gone through the island of Lesbos, which is a very small community. And so you can kind of get a sense of how incredibly devastating that shoreline was for so many years because of that. So I went.
Yeah. And when you got to Greece, I mean, was the sort of human connection, which I know you've spoken to me about over the phone, just profoundly impactful in the sense of not just being affected on an individual level, but trying to relay that back to Ireland, to an outside world, to actually, render visible this world and to share your sense of outrage, to share your sense of responsibility to protect, to stand up for things like freedom of movement, human rights, and so on. Was that something that drove you while you were there in the initial months? That sense of communicating, this precarity that you were witnessing firsthand?
I think it really settled in to my mind how important this was after a couple of months of having been there. We often get this sense because search and rescuers like myself are, I guess, very ego-driven and love posting pictures of ourselves holding babies in very precarious situations with the sunlight, ideally with explosions from both sides, because that gets the most funds, right? And now that's problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, because it's very problematic to post pictures of people who are in distress because it violates their right to privacy, and oftentimes they could be in contexts where those photos being published might lead to adverse consequences for their family back home, for example. The second reason, of course, is that it kind of misrepresents what happens. It isn't all that flash and bang and all gung-ho. It's mostly you do nothing. I spent months standing from midnight to 7 a.m. at the shoreline looking out. That sounds like my alarm. I thought that was Jesus. Looking out and just waiting and hoping to offer help if needed. But the vast majority of the time, asylum seekers, people in distress, are survivors. Like, so little needed to be done most of the time. And so when there was a situation, or we were called to situation, I'd hand out a bottle of water or just a smile. And I'm not diminishing that. I think that's really important because, again, the way that we as a European Union respond to this crisis is by denying that helping hand, is by locking our border down. And so providing a smile is hugely important. But it wasn't for months until we needed to do CPR, until we actually had people in distress. And it was then for me that it really settled in, because it also had given me enough time to realize that there was a growing tension. There had been a change, a shift. Lesbos Island, people are often very quick when they hear my story to say, Lesbos, Greece, must be full of racists, and that's why this thing is happening. And I think that's an overly simplified and very false, I think, way of looking at this. Lesbos was initially award-winning for the amount of solidarity it showed people in distress at sea. But then after years of having no support from Athens, from the main government, and Greece not having any support from the European Union, those solidarity feelings soured a little bit. And who is the first you look at as being part of the problem when your industry, your tourism falls apart? I mean, you can only imagine the same thing happening in Kerry, for example, where we rely on tourism. You would, of course, look at the asylum seekers and also those who help the asylum seekers. And so by the time I got there in 2017, there was already that kind of hint that perhaps search and rescue is part of the problem. Perhaps there's something wrong here. And so we had seen some cases, we had seen some arrests happen. And so it was at this moment that I realized there actually is a lot of need for people. And there also is a need to talk about this context because we're beginning to polarize. And it was a microcosm of what was happening across the world, I think, or at least in the US and in Europe, where we're being polarized on political issues, specifically around migration. And that's why I've begun talking about it more and more.
Yeah. And I think one of the things which is really fascinating about your story is the degree to which change is so slow to happen when you're faced with a state securitization regime that isn't doing its job. And just really briefly, Sean and I talked about this. I'm involved in a project called the Alarm Phone, which is a network of individuals in Europe that effectively enables migrants in distress to ring a telephone number in their boats. And our function is simply to remind the authorities of their responsibilities to intervene. Now, that is actually the case, and there's been over 2,500 of those since 2014, by the way, is a damning indictment on a whole range of nation states in the European Union who are simply not doing their job. And part of what we're trying to do, as we talked about, Sean, is trying to render visible that responsibility and accountability. And I think one of the things which you've reflected on, Sean, in your writing and so on, is NGO efforts are so often just a Band-Aid on a broken leg. And the big challenge is making governments take responsibility and account for what they're doing. But when they're doing the very opposite, which is to criminalize activists like yourself, there's not much hope there. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your sort of, I guess, position on state forms of securitization and what you witnessed, particularly in the Greek context.
Yeah, sure.
The absence of intervening, for example, is a major issue.
Yeah, just on that alarm phone example that you gave, my friend just the other day was contacted. She's got friends. She's worked in this sector for a long time, and so she has friends who work as interpreters or translators to help people who are in need of services. Mm-hmm. And they called her and they said there are 2 people missing in Evros, which is it's a body of water between Turkey and Greece, and we can't find them. And so she called the Coast Guard and said, she called the police first, then she called the Coast Guard. They wouldn't pick up, and eventually the Coast Guard picked up, and she said, there are 2 people missing. We need to find them, or I think they've since perished, but it was just the other day. We need to find them, and the Coast Guard asked, but what kind of people are they? Who? And she didn't indulge and said, these are people who are lost, we need to help them. Yeah, but where are they from? And she said, they're asylum seekers, and that was it. That was the end of the conversation. This is, I'm not trying to point out here, by the way, that this is across the border. This is an institutionalized policy, although I will hint that might be the case. But to go back to the original question then, at least in my experience, because we often see search and rescue as somehow being oppositional to state infrastructure, right? That what I often hear is that, and my Instagram DMs are very colorful with messages like this, that I'm in some way trying to undermine national security policy or trying to undermine the very valid life-saving efforts of the authorities. And I don't find that to be the case. In the ideal world, there would be no search and rescue at all because no one would be drowning. In a better world, the authorities would be doing this kind of work because the authorities have the equipment, they have the funds, they have everything you'd need to have a very solid search and rescue effort. And we saw that at the outset of the crisis. Operation Mare Nostrum, for example, was the Italian search and rescue efforts, which had the primary mandate of helping people, of a humanitarian action. That was swiftly replaced as the crisis wore on with the Frontex operation. Frontex, as I'm sure many of you know, is the European Border Control Agency. They now did search and rescue, but their primary focus was to view this problem through the prism of criminality, of illegal activity. It's a very subtle shift from saying there are people who are at risk of drowning to saying there are people undertaking this journey because they're smuggled and it's illegal. And that means that your policy portfolio is slightly different. You're not helping people anymore, you're stopping people from doing something. In the ideal world, the authorities would do search and rescue. They stopped doing that. In the world we live in, there is a gap in service. And if somebody doesn't fill that gap, people will fall through it and they'll drown. And that's literally what's happening. And so none of us want to do search and rescue. It shouldn't be happening, but it isn't. And I can give very concrete examples. For example, there was a UK border force vessel operating on Lesbos when I was there. This is, the United Kingdom can fund their border force. They do so in the channel very well at the moment. Mm-hmm. I got an email from from their medics on board asking if we can supply them with equipment because they'd exhausted theirs. They just didn't have anything left. Mm-hmm. They weren't being given enough resources. We trained the folks who ended up arresting us with first aid training because they couldn't do CPR. These are people who are going into boats to try and search and rescue people without the basic qualifications. This is what I mean, that there's this shift in policy, this gap, and this securitization has built up and has viewed this through the prism of illegal activities, and this is why we see these arrests. I guess to touch on my own personal experience with this securitization apparatus then is that I was doing a search and rescue, we say search and rescue operation. I was standing at the shoreline one night at 3 a.m. and the police that I had stood shoulder to shoulder with for months at this point arrived, and they said, "Where's your passport?" Which is pretty normal because they do these kinds of checks. I gave them my passport. They search around our Jeep. They pull off the number plate of the registered Jeep and they say, "There's something suspicious here. There's a sticker underneath it that appeared to be a military-style sticker." How they knew about it, I don't know. I had never seen it before. They took us in for questioning that night, myself and Sarah Martini. She's a good friend of mine, and she's also, she and her sister are quite famous because her sister is an Olympic swimmer now with the Refugee team. We were taken in for questioning and spent a night in a cell. The following morning, I was taken under armed guard to our warehouse. This is a warehouse full of medical equipment because we also run the only daytime clinic in Moray refugee camp, which is one of the biggest refugee camps in Europe until it burned down last year. They search through the boxes. They find nothing. They go to my home. They search through everything. They take my laptop, my phone. They go through my baking flour to look for drugs or whatever. They find nothing. We're released pending further investigation, and we thought, this must be it. This is a joke. This cannot lead to anything else because, one, we've done nothing wrong, and number two, the whole investigation seemed so random. About 5 days later, I was in Mytilene, which is the main town on Lesbos. I happened to be with a Greek speaker, and two old Greek grandfathers were mopeding by and shouting at each other, having a conversation across the road. Greeks drive like mad, and this is common practice. So we could overhear what they were talking about, and they were referencing this online article that had been published, saying that a spy, a German spy, I happen to be German, and his Syrian accomplice, that's my friend Sarah, were in a stolen military jeep trying to break into a naval base to steal state secrets. I mean, at first I thought, this is pretty cool. That's,
Yeah.
But because I had the confidence that, again, this was not going to go anywhere. I didn't realize that this was forming the very backbone of one of the largest anti-search and rescue criminal investigations that we see in Europe today, one of many, and we can get into that. And it really was exactly that story that has grown and has formed the backbone of this prosecution. They allege that I am a spy, that I'm a smuggler, that I have committed money laundering, that I'm part of a criminal organization, that I'm a fraudster, that I have illegally used radio frequencies, and so on and so forth. I was held in prison for 3.5 months in a pretrial capacity. Now, pretrial detention sounds like it would adhere to the principle of you're innocent until proven guilty, but I mean, I was handcuffed to murderers, and I spent time in a cell with convicted felons. There is, in my experience, no difference. Having said that, if you're going to go to prison, do it on a Greek island. It's not that bad. But it was awful. And I guess more frighteningly is that I still face 20 years in prison. And more frightening still is that if I face 20 years in prison for doing what any of you would also do, then all of us stand to face time in prison. Because when you step away and you pull off all of the layers of the rubbish that the prosecution has tried to spin, and if you want me to go into detail of what exactly they allege, I can do so, because prima facie, or at the surface, you would think, surely the Greek authorities wouldn't have done this for no reason. There must be some wrongdoing, and I can try to dispel that a little bit if you'd like. But if you accept that I've done nothing wrong, and all I've done was do exactly what any of you would do, then we all stand to lose something. The analogy I give here is that it's like arriving at the scene of a car crash, and there is someone lying on the road. What would you do first? Would you check their pulse or their passport first? Now, if you check their pulse first, you've committed the exact same crime that I'm supposed to have committed. And this is what is so frightening about securitization policy, is that it comes into direct contact with and diminishes our human rights, our human rights obligations, and in general, our civic space. This has to be seen in the broader European context of a backslide on the rule of law that the European Union Commission talks about as happening in Greece, in Hungary, in Poland, and in elsewhere. And it's frightening, and all of us stand to lose something.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you're touching upon there is that we reflect very little on that sort of pullback from the law within the European Union context, and we forget very quickly the geopolitical contexts of prior Western interventionisms across North Africa and the Middle East that created the Mediterranean crisis. And we can blame Cameron for lots of things, including Brexit, by the way. But we should not forget that he led the charge in bombing illegally Libya, Tunisia, and ports and so on. And that created a very simple scenario that we're now living through, which is the absence of the externalized border guards for the European Union in Libya, in Tunisia. And we forget all of that geopolitical context because it's very easy for us to do so. In other words, we've always had brutal border guards. They happen to be in Libya. They're now in Greece. And I think it's really important to insist upon that, absence of democracy at the borders of Europe and historicize that. And I think in so many ways, Sean, you are suffering from the necessary vilification and brutalization of border regimes of power. Which is why we all have huge empathy for your story, of course, and why we want to support you. But I'm so conscious of all the things we wanted to talk about, so I wanted to touch on a really important element, which you mentioned a little bit earlier, which is you were asked what kind of a refugee or what kind of an asylum or what kind of a human being were you saving? And I think that gets us to a very important question that's really important in terms of our self-criticism of how we react to otherness and difference. And one of the things which has heartened everybody, I think, about the Ukraine crisis is the extent of empathy that very quickly mobilized. But the difficult question there is there a question of whiteness at the very heart of why we reacted in the way we did to Ukraine differently to ways in which we reacted previously? It's a difficult question. It's a really important one for us in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe to reflect upon. But what are your thoughts on that aspect of empathy and the ways in which it's racialized in our contemporary world?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question, and friends of mine, friends who are engaged in this kind of advocacy work that I do, they often say, Sean, you know what, this shows it. This shows the systemic racism that's here. And I'm empathetic to that argument. But some make the extra step and say, these are all racist. See, so for example, a friend of mine who's been working in solidarity work for years with folks who are leaving Middle East and North Africa for reasons of conflict and have sought asylum and refuge here in Europe, and her parents never supported, didn't understand it, didn't really get why, but opened up their home to Ukrainians. And she says to me, this is evidence of their racism. And I, for a number of reasons, think that's the wrong approach. I try to avoid breaking things down in those really basic kind of them and us categories, because I'm not sure if you ever had this problem, but I've never had a successful conversation which I began with, you're a racist, but it just doesn't work. And why would it? Because it's immediately oppositional. And I think it's also too easy to do that. It's gratifying to point the finger and say that, but it often also misses nuance and legitimate fears and worries and context. It's kind of, I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. When I see a friend of mine is doing a podcast about young Ukrainians, they've just finished school, they're 18, and some of them will now go join the army, some will go off and go to music school, and this is really jarring experience where some are holding on to their normal life as best they can, and others are being forced to engage in a conflict or war that they never thought they'd have to experience. And when I think about that, I can see myself more than when I think about people who are crossing the Mediterranean. And if I can do it, and I've been in this context, then it's really normal that anybody would feel, I think, that sense of closeness with Ukraine, because just even geographically is closer. So I try to avoid the racialized conversation when I'm speaking to people. But it must be there, right? On some level, it must be there, because what is the difference? When you strip it down, it's people fleeing conflict, and we're treating one group of people as though they have every right to protection, because of course they do, and another as though they don't have that right, even though they, of course, do. what we need to do, I suppose, is if in the context of the Cold War, we always understood Russia as an enemy, I suppose. And so it's easy to pick up that heuristic and think, okay, Cold War, Russia's the enemy. So in this context, Ukraine is the victim, and that makes sense to me, and I can open up my doors. Perhaps it's different in the context of, as you were saying, Western governments led bombing campaigns in the kind of countries that now produce asylum seekers. So it's not so easy to think our war in Libya or our war in Iraq or Afghanistan, are they enemy, are they not enemy? And I think it's more difficult to understand why those are also refugees and asylum seekers in the exact same way as Ukrainian people are, and that everyone has the right not to die. And I think that's the most basic term that we can bring it back to. Why we can't do that might have that element of racialization.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really helpful. I think to be churlish about the empathy which is possible in the world now, and not just in relation to Ukraine, but also in terms of responding more responsibly to the political ecology challenges of how the economies of our world are regulated or deregulated in the context of COVID-19. It's hugely important, and one of the things we've tried to do here in the university through the University of Sanctuary Movement is to use this moment to say it shouldn't just be about Ukraine. So we've tried to broaden that discourse into the Scholars at Risk program being additionally supported, not just Ukrainian scholars. And it's trying to, I guess, positively inflect the ways in which empathy is shown to be so powerful. Yeah. When, weirdly, security, and it happens to be, European security in some senses, but it's human beings deemed a security risk in Ukraine, suddenly swung the story. So it is about securitization and rendering visible that precarity, again, in the context of so many challenges we face in the world. Sean, I wanted to ask you about your efforts in terms of advocacy and communication of activism per se. Sure. I mean, as an activist, we work with our students all the time about the necessary empathy to feel in connecting to the world and being affected by the world and allowing yourself to be affected by the world, and what that can elicit in terms of actual efforts working with communities and so on. It seems to me in a world of impoverished leadership, and we don't need to just look at Trump and Johnson in this sense, that citizenship is always about leadership in local communities, in local contexts, in ways which inspire. And your story inspires. I was telling my little daughter, Sienna, I was telling Sean, she's 5 and she's incredibly inspired by what Sean has done. And I think it's about inspiring people as well. To volunteer, to have a sense of community, to have a sense of empathy, to have a sense of connection to somebody over there who may not have everything that I have, but I want to feel part of an interconnected world. Could you, or have you maintained your positivity? You've obviously always felt that, but I mean, you're under pressure now and in ways which I can't fully fathom. Do you still maintain that sensibility of why it's important to advocate and volunteer?
As soon as I'm off the stage, I'll be miserable and I'll go right back to how I usually am. No, I think so. Look, there are two ways of addressing this. I think the first is to say why I think community is so important, and the second is why I can continue doing all of this. So the first one I think is, I guess I grew up in Kerry, and you wouldn't immediately think there's a lot of refugee solidarity happening there, but the reason I got involved to some extent is because I've got a friend, Catherine Young, who works with folks who live in direct provision and just does dance with them. I'm a terrible dancer, I don't do it, but I really encourage it, and I've been involved, and I've seen these things happen. And watching a Ceili Afro Dabka is one of the most interesting things I've seen, and how that works and how communities can really come together and build into one, and that's really lovely to see. My grandmother and her lifelong girlfriend came to Kerry. You can imagine what it's like coming in as two lesbians into one of the more conservative parts of the country. But we're accepted because they're just outgoing and they want to be involved in the community spirit, and they were immediately accepted. And so I think that just seemed really natural to me. And I continue to try and work with people, and I think more so now not finding solidarity initiatives, but what interests me is speaking to people who disagree with me and understanding why, and try to reach across that far as well, because I realize that I'm in my echo chamber all the time, and that the risk of being in my echo chambers, I think it's quite severe. I had this conversation once with somebody from the BLM movement about whose responsibility it is to make somebody not be against, I don't know, broader inclusion or better justice. And the argument that was put forward by him, he said, it's not my job to teach people about anti-racism. It's not my job to make a racist not racist. And well, I think that's true. Obviously, no one's responsibility, and I would never advocate that you should put yourself in a context where you're at risk of, I don't know, trauma. But applying it to myself, it isn't my responsibility to convince someone that we should have a border policy that respects existing laws. But it also isn't anybody's responsibility to not hold those views. And if I want to live in that world, I need to do something about it. And so for me, reaching out to people and trying to understand why they might be opposed to my views is important, I think, and to try and come at it from the most cooperative and understanding position possible. So for me, community is building not only with the other in that direction, but the other in the political sense. The reason that I still feel like I can do that is because I've been so privileged. I have had so much support. Yes, I faced 20 years in prison. Yes, I've been in prison, but I'm on a stage right now, and I've been offered a platform that so few have not. And in that sense, I feel so supported, and that I can continue doing these things. I met people in prison, refugees who weren't given a trial. They were never told what they did wrong. At least the authorities realized that they had to charge me with something to get me into a cell. I met folks in prison who were never charged with anything, and they are likely still in prison now. There's one guy, he was North African, I think Tunisian. I was being transferred from a jail to a prison, so into this bigger institution, and I had to go through this holding cell, which is the worst place I've ever seen in my entire life. 30 people crammed into a cell as big as this stage with a hole in the ground for a toilet and no running water and too few calories and no windows, and it was filthy and horrid. But I spent 5 days there or so. He had been there for 3 months when I arrived. He had not been charged with anything. He had not committed any crime. Literally he had done nothing. The reason he was there is because his asylum wasn't accepted, but he refused to be sent back to Tunisia because he was afraid for his life, and Turkey refused to take him back as well. So he was caught in limbo. He could go nowhere, and so he was put into prison. That evening, and again, I'm so privileged, I happened to have a little tiny MP3 player, it had a couple of songs on it, and I was listening to it, and I was reading, and he approached me and indicated that he wanted to listen to it, so I gave it to him to listen to. And he was the first time he'd listened to music in a very long time. Put in his ears, pressed play, and was dancing around, which was, not that I can diagnose anybody, but he was very euphoric at that moment. And that evening, he started banging his head against the concrete wall because I guess he couldn't deal with the juxtaposition of having had listened to music and now being denied it again. And the police came in and beat him, and that was it. I didn't see him again because I was transferred to a much better place. My point here is that I feel I can do this kind of work because I am so supported, and I have had so many resources thrown at me, and I have an excellent legal team, and politicians are willing to listen to my story. The vast majority of people never have that right. I mean, I am one of at least 180 individuals who have been criminalized across the European Union. I got an email from a German-speaking pastor once who was criminalized because he let people sleep on his church pews during a storm. These people were asylum seekers, and so he was told, that's illegal. You are facilitating the illegal entry of individuals. That's smuggling, and you are being criminalized. Of course, he was acquitted eventually, but these are the kinds of actions we see being criminalized. The vast majority of them not spoken about are unknown and are unseen, and that's not even to talk about the amount of asylum seekers who are themselves being criminalized because they're told that they're smugglers. And if I could just connect what you actually said with Libya, because you're absolutely right in saying, of course, we externalized our border infrastructure to the Gaddafi regime for a long time. The question you might have is, if I'm trying to convince you that I'm not a smuggler, neither directly because I haven't directly done it, but neither indirectly because search and rescue doesn't motivate or doesn't facilitate the kind of illegal border crossings, because there's no research to suggest it does. The question you might have is, okay, well then what is causing smuggling? Something must be causing smuggling. And you can reach for very basic kind of arguments here. There's either a push factor or a pull factor. A push factor is the really obvious one. If I'm living in Kabul in Afghanistan and the Taliban's about to take over, I will be pushed out of that country because I'm trying to leave it. Pull factors are slightly different. Now, supposedly, search and rescue is a pull factor because by providing, and this is the argument that I often hear from policymakers, I've been at the European Union speaking with policymakers who've said to me, Sean, you might not have meant to do it directly, but because you were in that water offering life-saving services, you made it easier to sell smuggling tickets for people to cross that border. When I first heard this, I was sitting in prison. I thought, how naive am I being that I think I can help people? But all this time, I'm actually facilitating this illegal activity, causing deaths. But then I had lots of time on my hands, so I read lots of research. There is no correlation, either positive nor negative, between the amount of search and rescue and the amount of people passing through it. There just isn't. The question then is, well, what is? And the outrageous thing is, at least from my understanding, is that the policies that the European Union puts into place to stop smuggling causes the smuggling. This is for three pretty obvious reasons. All of us in this room presently have the correct passport or visa. That's why we're allowed to be in Europe. You have to be in Europe with the correct paperwork. To be an asylum seeker, you have to cross a border. You cannot get asylum from a would-be host country in your country of origin. You have to come into the territory of the would-be host country. And we secure our border, as we've discussed this entire evening. We secure our border against people seeking asylum. So what option do you have? You are driven into the hands of smugglers because there are no safe or legal ways of becoming a refugee if you plan on taking the asylum route. The policies against smuggling cause the smuggling. And I was recently emailing with Omar Schatz, who is a professor at Sciences Po, who submitted a complaint to the International Criminal Court, alleging that the European Union is complicit in crimes against humanity because we outsource our border control infrastructure to the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, for example. And as you were saying, we've bombed Libya to get rid of Gaddafi. Then we supported, at different times, different sides of that conflict that rose out of the civil war that ensued. So you had General Haftar and then the UN-recognized government, and they were fighting. And they were shelling each other, and who was in the middle? But folks in detention centers, black sites, effectively, who are trying to make this journey to safety. Folks that should be given a right to seek asylum. But we pay the so-called Libyan Coast Guard to stop them from coming through, to operate as our shield. Now, investigative research, academic research indicates that guess who is also smuggling people from Libya into Europe? The so-called Libyan Coast Guard. We're effectively financing it. We are causing so many of the problems that we hope to solve with this horrendous policy regime. What would solve this problem? I'm not asking for the European Union to do more than it has already said it would do. Just to respect the human rights obligations that it already has, to respect the laws that already exist. That's all. That would go some way of providing a safe means of seeking asylum, reduce the deaths at sea, and also hopefully stop the hypocritical policies that we see being enacted on our behalf at Europe's borders.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about using the word hypocrisy because, you know, the torture camps continue unabated. There's 2 new ones in Libya just this last year, which the European Union are fully aware of. And, you know, it's the out of sight, out of mind, you know, necessary element of international relations that, you know, has always functioned in that way. Sean, we don't have a huge amount of time, but I wanted to ask you, you know, briefly before questions about your own, you know, personal challenges of dealing with all of this, and you've got a wonderful sensibility and clarity in expressing a whole range of concerns about your story, but it must have and it must continue to take a really great personal toll, and I suppose that's one of the things which happens when you put your head above the parapet in this life is you suffer the consequences in ways that are often unseen. I mean, has it been difficult, the waiting, I presume, and we all got elements of that through COVID-19, where we were like, geez, I'm sick of waiting for everything, but has it been a really difficult, you know, few years? Would you like to share, I suppose, the consequences of, the ways in which you have been criminalized with the audience?
Yeah, we're desperate to go to trial. We really want to go to trial because we know that we're innocent. And if we get to trial, we can prove that. It seems the prosecution isn't as confident about their position because they have dragged this out for years and years and years. We went to trial in last year for the smallest of crimes. The spying is actually only a misdemeanor, which puts into context what James Bond actually did. Using WhatsApp, apparently. This is the crux of why I'm a spy, is because I use encrypted communications services. All of you are also spies. So they went to trial for those smaller charges. It was immediately adjourned because the prosecution had failed to contact all the 24 defendants. They had failed to write in a language that any of us understand. There was a page missing out of the document. We informed them in advance that because there's a defendant who is a lawyer who can't be tried at the lower level court, we have to go to the appellate level court. They ignored that message, that they ignored that correspondence. So we went to trial. It was immediately adjourned. And only recently has the trial date been reset for January, this coming January. But we expect it to be adjourned again. And that's to say nothing about the felonies, the really serious crimes that we're supposed to have committed. And unfortunately, and it seems that they can take up to 15 more years to bring this to trial. And we expect them, given that it's already been since 2018, for them to take that. Because the real point here is we're not guilty. There's nothing wrong with trying to help people. But the sword of Damocles, the threat of prosecution, the huge costs that having spent time in prison, the mental health, all of those costs are known to other search and rescuers. And so today there's no more search and rescue happening on the island of Lesbos. And that's the point. This is a chill factor. It's an attempt to stop people from doing this kind of work. Not that I want to tell you to do it for those reasons, but we should, to some extent, try to fight against that. So we'll be left in limbo for a very long time, and that has had, as I've said, huge financial costs and personal costs. And I would have at some point, I have friends in the audience who have children, that I would have liked to be at that point in my own life, but I don't feel like I can be now. Given that I'd like to be not in prison for that. And but also as a career, I've applied to jobs and they've either been very sympathetic or they've said, well, I'm not sure if you're innocent. But even if they're sympathetic, they think, why take the risk? Why do that? This person might not be around next year and I might not be. And so while I've been very lucky to do things like this, I've also not been able to live the life that I'd normally wanted to. And as I said, doing search and rescue was something I wanted to do for 3 months because I felt I had some very niche skills that I could have put to use for that very short time in which I had the ability to volunteer. It doesn't define me. It's increasingly defining me now. But I'm not some Sean the search and rescuer or the activist. I'm Sean the person who went to volunteer for a while and got really screwed over. It wasn't what I hoped to do for the rest of my life. And in that sense, it has been a large cost. Mm-hmm. At the same time, and again, I can't stress it enough, I've been so supported. And I feel quite guilty saying on a stage that, oh, my life is difficult. It isn't that difficult in light of that. So I'll leave it there. I think.
Yeah. You might have been screwed over, but you were undefeated, Sean. Maybe that's a good point to open up questions, actually. We've got about 10 minutes or so. Thanks to Sean for sharing so many really important thoughts. Questions for Sean? Yep.
So first of all, welcome to the TV. I learned a lot, very insightful. Sean in particular, it's very inspiring to see a young man as yourself living out your purpose and standing up for something you believe in. Incredibly brave and very inspiring. I guess my question is, I understood that there's certain parties that should be doing their job here that aren't really taking the accountability and doing it. I'm very curious as to what you think the motive, and this question is directed to both of you. I'm very curious as to what you think the motive is for them not to do those jobs. Obviously, you would have explained a little bit about the Libyan Coast Guard and that particular scenario. I'd be very interested if you could maybe build my understanding about other parties and why the motive isn't there to take accountability.
Do you want to lead on that? Or
Yeah, I could take a lead on that. I mean, the Alarm Phone project is a really good example of what efforts are necessary to hold governments to account. And one of the things which the network does is it documents every single instance. It historicizes it and it archives it. That's not just for posterity, that's for potential legal efforts to hold Frontex in particular to account. As I said earlier, I mean, it's shocking that that has to happen. But one of the things which we've learned from history, sadly, is that states get away with it all the time if we don't vigorously and robustly insist upon the rule of law, because it'll just slide. And there have been literally thousands, and Sean will tell you this, where the Coast Guard, Frontex, literally don't respond to people in distress, which is illegal.
Or worse.
Or they, so what the Alarm Phone does is it basically puts it on the record that this call was logged. Did you get this call? It's as simple as that. I mean, there's no search and rescue in the Alarm Phone project. It's literally a communicative, reification of responsibility. But it's incredibly difficult. And it's a real sad moment in our contemporary democracy that we have to do that in the European Union. And most people don't even know about it, And Sean, unfortunately, has seen that firsthand. But
yeah, I agree with that. And, Alarm Phone is what we fall back on now. That when we get messages, somebody says, what can I do? I want to help out. And we usually say, do you know the risks of it? What are your skills? Are you sure you want to do it? Here are the potential consequences of that. And so we often just have to rely on Alarm Phone and at least hope to document what's happening. But I guess you asked also specifically about which actors are in this space and why are they so inactive, or why are they counterproductive.
So just to clarify, I guess parties which aren't taking accountability for the job they're supposed to do, and I understand the ineffectiveness of those organizations in doing their job and how such a system can make them more accountable. But I suppose what I'm trying to understand is, at the end of the day, the people carrying out these missions, the Coast Guards, and whatnot, they are humans, and they're motivated by something. And fair enough, if it's from the orders above that they're confined. I suppose for me, I'm trying to decipher, is the motive the men on the ground carrying out the mission, or is the motive coming from above to not meaningfully contribute for the good of the situation?
Yeah, I think I don't want to sound conspiratorial here, and so I won't. I think it's probably too easy to try and point out either it's these individuals or it's the policymakers. At least what I've noticed is that at around 2015-16, I think it began with the Foreign Office in the UK, you had this idea of the so-called pull factor enter discourse in the context of the migrant crisis. This idea that what we want to stop here is illegal immigration. So we see two things happening. There's a really subtle word shift. If you say somebody's a refugee, that comes with all the obligations and the requirements that we have in helping people, because in international law you have a right to seek refuge and we have an obligation to allow that to happen. Not to mention, of course, the right to life and to safety and all of those things. But when we shift the words to immigration or illegal immigration, we begin to cast doubt upon whether that person actually has a right to be here. And so we see them as somebody who needs help, to somebody who wait, is this an economic migrant? Is this a threat to me? We suddenly see all other associations building here. And I think we saw that shift happening, or perhaps it was always there. But for a time we spoke about refugees, and then we spoke about irregular migrants, illegal immigration, and that brings different policy options. I'm not sure why that happened. You can draw your own conclusions. But what we say at the same time is this shift in narrative from helping people in a humanitarian context to securing our border because of this illegal immigration, and also to try and hold people accountable who cause this illegal immigration. And that's why we see the criminalization of humanitarian actors, search and rescuers, so on and so forth. And so it's almost a very subtle narrative shift. And when you view it that way, it's not that the authorities or whoever the parties you refer to aren't doing their job, it's that they're doing their job, but they're doing the wrong job. Mm-hmm. And at least that's how I view it. When I've spoken to policymakers at the European Union level, I've often had that this idea of migration or immigrants rather than refugees, that we don't talk about the same thing, and it might not seem important, but it is important, and it gives us a whole different view of what's actually happening at our border.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Questions? Yep.
Sean. Yeah, Sean, I found that inspiring, actually. You really are a great example of a tradition of Irish NGOs working among people who don't have the same wealth or resources as we have here in Ireland now, especially. Specifically, I would like to ask you about the political support you're getting here, or the lack of it, and maybe starting, I suppose, at a local level and moving into the national dial, and then on to the MEP level. Do you feel it's been addressed with sufficient urgency among our TDs, our government, and our MEPs?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, in terms of the Irish context, and I do take a lot of inspiration from having grown up in Ireland. I mean, I'm not sure. I feel Irish. I think I can say that. I moved here when I was 4. I studied in Irish and all of those things, and so that sense of community that I built here really was part of why I went off and did all of this. So you're right in identifying that there's something Irishness about it. And I think in general, Ireland has been more vocal than perhaps other countries about human rights issues or humanitarian issues. But do we do enough? And none of us do enough, I suppose. But specifically, I think that, at least with regards to my case, and I guess I'm not sure if you're asking about my case specifically or about the migrant crisis in general, but I can talk about my case perhaps better because I think you can speak about the wider policy better than I can.
Probably both, actually. Just first of all, in your own predicament, having this threat over you
Sure.
specifically,
Sure.
and then moving on to the wider.
That's perfect.
Are you getting political support from our TDs and government or from our MEPs? What's sufficient urgency?
Okay, so yeah, thank you. When I was in prison, the country that you fly in on with the passport that you fly in on, they're saddled with your problems basically, and Germany unfortunately was saddled with mine. And to be fair, they were great. And well, there's not much you can do really, is there? Because what you often hear is Greece. This is the cradle of democracy. So it doesn't happen in Greece. This could never happen in Greece. You must be mistaken. You must have done something wrong. There's very little that a European Union member state will do in another European member state's criminal procedures, because the assumption is that they have a functioning criminal system. And yet they had been a little bit supportive. The Irish don't have an embassy in Greece. They have a consular presence though. And when I was released from prison and I went to thank the German ambassador, the consular representative was also there, and the German ambassador was like, it was lovely, it was great. He was like, okay, Sean, well done, we'll support you in whatever you need to do, okay. Which was exactly what you'd expect from a German representative, I guess. But the Irish one, she was like, a bunch of feckers, aren't they? it just reminded me of how much I love Ireland and how... cozy is the wrong word, but there's something cozy about the support you get in Ireland, and I've been so supported in Ireland. We have had the support of huge human rights organizations, international human rights organizations, but they didn't go near us until there was enough support from Ireland and from friends and family that talked to their neighbors, and they talked to their neighbors, and it went bigger and bigger, and that's how it grew. And so I really feel I have been very supported. And yet, TDs don't feel that they can weigh in on this situation. One, because I'm not actually Irish. I don't have citizenship. And so they don't feel that they can, as much as I'd like that. But MEPs have been much more vocal. Grace O'Sullivan, for example, who sits with the Green Party, has been incredibly vocal about not only our case, but the wider context, and has shown so much solidarity. And we've found some really key allies in the Green MEPs and MEPs in general to speak about this issue and to try and change policy, slow going as it might be, in the wider context. But I think you can speak about the wider context.
No, I mean, really briefly, because people want to hear from you, Sean, but I think it's a brilliant question, and I think it behoves us to think about what is our responsibility politically in terms of leadership. I love your story about that sort of homeliness and support and all of that. And Ireland has always been incredibly inspiring in an NGO context in terms of interventionism and empathy towards the world, but certainly not politically. And I think the history of our recent Irish politics shows that. And it's the absence which is really worrying for me. I mean, we've got a seat in the Security Council, loads of opportunity to insist upon a whole range of things in terms of non-alliance, for example, around cluster bombs, making it illegal. We have the power to do it, and we're not doing it. And the ways in which, to answer your question really quickly again, I mean, what we should be doing is insisting upon, international humanitarian law in the European Union, and insisting upon that through our Navy, who are in the Mediterranean, and saying, you have a responsibility to intervene. And making accountable networks and activating that. And our political apparatus is very, very prone to allowing things to slide and not take on the difficult challenge. And I think we forget how powerful we can be as a non-aligned country in taking a leadership position that's based on principle, because people want to get behind principle, I think, more than we allow them to, because they don't know about the concerns that people have, But that's why Sean's, I think, story is a personification of what we deem security to be all about. It's really a security crisis for us when it should be a security crisis for them. I mean, you've talked and you've written about that, Sean. It's about how we view the world and how we say who should be protected and shouldn't be. But I think we've time for a few more questions before. Yeah, here at the front and behind.
Sorry. Fascinating, all of it. But one thing, I suppose, is, economically, migration has always been shown to be a net benefit to every country, that it is a net benefit. It provides a net benefit. And that's across all sorts of instances. And why do you both think, we're really at a tipping point? I mean, we've been at several tipping points, but we're really at a tipping point with climate change now, and the whole climate justice and that whole migration piece there. Why is it? And I remember, I've heard been fortunate to hear a lot of people talking in this area. Why is it we can't make any headway on this migration piece? Why is there no, even a small sliver of kindness in there, and even in terms of seeing even the practical side of it, which is the net benefit and how we are needed. I can look at our hospitality sector in Ireland. We're 40%, down on that. We can't get people to do jobs, and there are so many people who need jobs. Anyway, and there's a whole housing thing. I understand that, and I'm not coming at this, I hope, from a naive point of view. But it's trying to understand the negativity, trying to understand that awful approach there is internationally, that it can't be somehow flipped. Into what can we do to flip it and to get back, of course, to ensuring that human rights and putting, to making Europe accountable for that. That's one side of it. But is it like a massive PR campaign? Is there some, the statistics stand up? Why is it all so wrong?
There's
All yours, man.
2 minutes.
yes.
Fix
Goodbye.
the world, buddy.
I think I'd have at least two things to say about that, and I probably want to address your question in the way that you would like, and I certainly can't do a good job of that, I'm sure, because it's such a big question. But just on the point of, yes, you're absolutely, at least from the research that I've done, economic migrants are a net benefit in general. These arguments that they are a drain on taxes generally not borne out in Western European countries anyway, and I think in the US either, but I'm not sure about the statistics there. But one reason that I push against that analysis, and not against you as such, but when I raise this argument, I know when I say, yeah, but they're a net benefit, it implies that you could only be deserving of that help if you're a benefit. And the beautiful thing about human rights is that it doesn't matter. You could be anybody. You can still avail of your human rights. So your ability to get asylum shouldn't depend on your economic viability or profitability for a country. I had this argument once with a campaigner. We were discussing kind of how can we get people involved. how can we speak to more people? And he said, yeah, but John, you know what I'd never do? I'd never save a fascist. Drowning fascist, I'd leave. That is absolutely the wrong way of looking at it. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're on the right, if you're on the left, you could be a murderer. You don't deserve to drown. You deserve to be treated with the full force of your human rights. And that obliges us to help everybody. It doesn't matter who. And so, in that sense, I tend to avoid the economic benefits argument, but you're absolutely right in pointing them out. And I think if it's an effective tool, then I think we should use it, but with the caveat of recognizing that it in some way diminishes the strength of the human rights argument to some extent. I think that's the main thing I would say about that. The second, about how to reach people, and whether it's a huge PR campaign, if we had the money, I'm sure we'd do it. The problem is that I think we've been speaking about it a little bit, or at least I've realized that I'm speaking about this issue not in the correct way. I read this book recently by Jonathan Haidt. He's a psychologist. He talks about why people are polarized on different issues. And among other things, the main point is that people tend to have their moral views, and immigration, security, are all moral views. They don't exist in a rational plane. They exist in a moral plane. They are held by intuition. We form our moral views like that. And then we use our intellectual, at least that's what he says, to kind of defend that position. So we don't use our rational ability to think, what's the best way of forming a secure society? We feel what the best way is and then defend it with our rational arguments. And so what that basically means in a nutshell is that we can't argue our way to convincing someone of a position. At least I've never had, and as I said at the outset, I've never begun a conversation saying you're racist and then arguing our way towards common ground. You need to build more collaboratively. At least that's what I found to be most effective. And so for me, and this doesn't satisfy you at all, but it's about reaching out to my neighbors who disagree with me and understanding why they disagree with me, and to find common ground without saying that they're wrong necessarily, but that their views might be problematic, or that we might have something that we can build on together. And so I think for me, what I can do is have a more collaborative rather than conflictual approach or conflict approach to the migration conversation that I don't feel we're always having, because we're always just hurling insults at each other, which just doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great answer, and I think your question is a brilliant question, and I think the biggest challenge we face now is actually, showing why solidarity is important in the world, and envisioning a shared, interconnected sense of vulnerability. And I think that's even more important now in the context of climate change, as you mentioned. COVID-19 in particular has brought that home to us. And I think it's about actually demonstrating the productive way in which we can think differently about security. I mean, having direct provision centres here in Ireland is ridiculous if you haven't thought about it in the context of the European Union, what's happening elsewhere. It's about joining the dots on a more humane way in which to think through questions of migration that needs to happen, I think, which is part of the big communication challenge that you're talking about, which is so important to show people why caring about somebody over there is really, really, really important. And I think that challenge, by the way, is in academia as much as anywhere else, by the way. I mean, one of the things that I dearly love is going to my primary school, the primary school of my kids, to talk about things like political ecology. I don't use that phrase, but I do talk about why protecting nature over in China and not encroaching on forests is important for us here in Ireland. And I think it's little challenges like that and taking on the challenge of communication, saying why that precarity and that lack of regulation over there is important for us here, and to insist upon regulation again, to insist upon a more responsible way of managing the environment. I think that's the huge challenge that we all face. But I know we're way over time, Katrina, but there's two more questions I want to take, because I see them behind this man here with the glasses. Yeah, just here. Is it okay for two more questions? Two more questions, and then we're...
Thank you. Hello. I'm just curious, if you could ring your younger self just as you're setting off, or the organization that you're with, so to speak, tell them you'll have this amount of time before the process is the punishment. At some point in the future, things will stop. In the meantime, plan for X, Y, and Z. Is there some kind of advice you could give either your younger self or the organization that might have made a difference?
Oh, okay. I was going to answer that differently until the last moment. So the question is basically, what could we have done to insulate ourselves from this issue to some extent? And right?
Well, however you want to interpret it.
Okay, fine. Then answer the first way and then the second way, if you don't mind. So the way that I usually get asked this question is, would you do it again if you were given the opportunity? And I would definitely, because I'm a psychopath. No, because I think it's I think it's really important to not. If I were to say no, we would have lost to some extent, and we need to insist upon the human rights obligations that we have. We need to continue fighting for that. We shouldn't give in to exactly what this prosecution aims to do. The second question, I think, is a probably more important one, which is what could have been done differently. And I joined ERCI, this organization in Greece, for two reasons. One, it was Greek, and I felt that as somebody who grew up in Ireland, going all the way to the side of the world, other side of Europe to help out, I wanted to at least be part of a Greek operation because Greek people are feeling increasingly disenfranchised. And I think this is why there's hardening views, is because they've had the UNHCR and European organizations and everyone else come in, and suddenly the Greek people who were there handing out the blankets in the first place are suddenly disempowered and have no idea what's going on and have very little control. That was a bit oversimplified, but you get what I'm saying. I joined them also because they had the best relationship with the authorities, and from my point of view, and I've gotten criticism from this from the left, that I was too accommodating. I was naive to think that the authorities were doing the right job, but from my point of view, it was important, and perhaps it is quite naive, to think that best thing is to work with the authorities to try and improve the situation rather than stand on the outside and then work to some extent in opposition to them, because that didn't seem right to me. And so I joined this organization because it had this good relationship. So in that sense, I don't think I could have done more than that. Like, short of joining the army, I couldn't have been more accommodating and more willing to share resources and information. And as I was saying, and I'm happy to share evidence of why I think I'm innocent, but you can see from their own files that they use against me that I in fact communicated all the time with the authorities and shared information and tried to be as forthcoming as I could be, more than we have a legal obligation to be. And so there's nothing else that I think I could have done. And that's the point here. The question posed in a different way is, okay, Sean, you might have been morally right, but you were legally wrong. And that people are oftentimes sympathetic to that and think, I can see why you did it, Sean, but you shouldn't have broken the law. That's not the point. The point is, yes, I did what I think is morally right, but it's also our legal responsibility. That isn't the point of tension. The point of tension is that the authorities are not respecting the law. And I think that's the important thing to kind of really drill into that with that question. But I'm not sure that answered it.
Yep. Katrina will never get us back, but I'm going to take one more question. I saw a question there. Sorry. Yeah, is it back? I think. Oh, sorry. Is it here? Where?
Fight's yours.
Yeah, it's up back somewhere.
I guess obviously you alluded to it there a little bit around a criticism of the left that's probably there and probably quite. I guess the question is, if tomorrow the laws change, as we've seen, obviously we've also alluded to a populist push, we've alluded to change in European views on, frankly, human rights. Everyone in this room has a model of human rights that they believe in. There are actors that clearly and emphatically don't. At what point, and again tying in the climate change thing of it's very clear for any honest communicators have made it very clear that the so-called migrant crisis that we are now experiencing is prologue at absolute best. That's going to be the next 20 years will be more and more people moving. Do you personally find an appeal to kind of a moral beyond? Like, what if what you did was illegal under a Greek legal regime or under a European legal system? It's still right, though, isn't it? Or am I like, even if it becomes illegal tomorrow, and maybe we need to turn off the cameras for this, but is it going to remain, is it going to remain correct? I think it is, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and that's a very challenging question for me to answer, I think, but it's an important one because of that. And you're absolutely right. What would change? If the law changed tomorrow, then would I suddenly not do this kind of work? I think by a wiggle out answer is, but it hasn't changed, and the laws are there, and we have the right and we have the obligation to do all of those things. But there are contexts in which we don't. Like, we can look back into history and look at, I don't know, underground railroads, for example, where you're taking someone's property away from them. That's how we viewed humans in that context. Yeah, of course it's still right. And that is the aspirational, or the political side of human rights. They don't just have a legal dimension that you can always rely on, and they have a certain political or social dimension that you need to constantly fight for. I had this conversation, I had the very honorable moment of meeting the Supreme Court, the President of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom just a few days ago. And we had a conversation, and where are human rights? What is the thrust of them? How do they exist? Do they exist on some spiritual level? Are they almost religious, or do they come from religion and therefore are universal and constant and everlasting? To my mind, they aren't. They are a social construction that we have to agree upon. And I think viewing them through that prism, by not relying on the legal arguments that laws always exist and they will always exist, I think that's naive. And if we rely on this idea of a permanent human rights law, then we lose the idea that they're actually really vulnerable. And we constantly to reaffirm them, always fight for them. Even if we presently have the upper hand, we need to maintain them. And so I view your question, I'm not going to answer it, but I'm going to say I need to think about it all the time. I need to always be reminded that we need to fight for them, because if we don't, then those will drift from being permanent to being laws, to being quasi-laws, to being forgotten. And then we've lost it. So you're right in holding us to accountable, I think, for that.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good point to finish, in wishing you well in your dealings with the law, Sean. I think you can sense a huge level of support here and across the country, and particularly in Kerry, who are on their way to an All-Ireland, are they? But I think the questions and the enthusiasm and support for your story is really symptomatic of your character, and we wish you well, Sean, in your dealings with getting justice. And I think you're absolutely right in the last thing you said, which is that the law is a very delicate thing. It's something that has to be activated and fought for. And we wish you all the very, very best in that, Sean, over the next year or so in bringing this case to a conclusion as soon as possible. And just to thank Sean, and again to Katrina, for enabling this a moment that I'm very, very proud to be part of. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you so much.